A false peace is no peace at all. Hi, I'm Christian Nielsen, and welcome to the Path of Beauty. This week I want to talk about something that Jesus is quoted as saying in Matthew 25 that seems to go against a lot of his other teachings, and unfortunately has been used by some to justify the fact that Jesus might be okay with some levels of violence. I have heard people in the gun rights groups say this, and I've even very sadly recently heard people say this is a justification for bombing a girls' school in Iran that killed 160 children. It's a sad fact that I believe that this is misappropriated. It's a passage where Jesus says, I come not to bring peace. Seems to go against a lot of other things he said. But I come as a sword. And he talks about how families may be torn apart, how communities may be torn apart by his message. He warns his disciples and all who follow him that they could face violence against them for what they do, because a lot of people would see them as being divisive by trying to bring up, the things that still seem controversial, taking care of the poor, making sure children don't starve, controversial things like that. And he knew that this would set people against each other. If he's to bring this kingdom, or I like to call it kingdom of justice, it's not going to come easily, and it never does. So Jesus also talks about the sparrow, and that God is paying attention to the sparrow. And if God can pay attention to the sparrow, God can pay attention to you. And God will be on the side of justice. So again, this is the gospel reading that happens to be on the lectionary this week, which I am actually preaching on as well at Lindale Lutheran Church. And if I am being honest, this has always made me uncomfortable. I really prefer the Jesus of the Beatitudes that are hardly ever mentioned by a lot of people in the Christian nationalist camp. The ones who want to put the 10 Commandments in a classroom, but maybe don't want to talk about putting something like the Beatitudes up that talks about how we care for each other. And of course, religion does not have a place in a classroom. I like the Jesus who heals the sick. That's the Jesus I'm usually advocating for. But Jesus says, do not think I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. Those words are startling, as I think they were meant to be. They feel dangerous. In a world that's already fractured by deep political divides, war, systemic violence against entire communities, which has been ongoing as recently as this past week, when an officer opened fire on a car that had black people in it and killed a 1-year-old boy. Sadly, many believe that the sword is literal, that this means violence is okay. I'm not sure how you could reconcile everything else Jesus taught by cherry-picking this one thing, the one time where he actually talks about violent imagery. And this is where I struggle sometimes with with Christian conservatives, especially, is that it's a metaphor. It's not literal. But we have to ask ourselves, what kind of peace is Jesus talking about here? And what kind of peace is Jesus disrupting? Too often in our culture, peace is just a code word for quiet. It's a Band-Aid to cover a gaping wound. It's a polite demand, just don't stir things up, just keep with the status quo. It's a peace that tells the oppressed to wait, tells the marginalized not to rock the boat, and tells people of faith to keep their religion private and comfortable and don't get too political. And we have to be careful that celebrations like Juneteenth aren't an opportunity to pat ourselves on the back for something we haven't really done yet. These are reminders that we have so far to go. And so many of my Black siblings this week have said how much they don't want to celebrate Juneteenth when a 1-year-old boy is killed by a police officer. And I understand, because as much as I can understand, I understand that often we white folks, those of us who are mostly white, will celebrate these things as achievement. If you're my age, do you remember the 90s when we had solved racism? I remember in 2008 when a CNN commentator said that because Barack Obama was elected, that we are now a post-racial society. How does that feel if you're a part of that community still being oppressed? How does peace do harm? True peace, biblical shalom, is not just the absence of tension. It's the presence of justice. And you cannot dismantle systems of oppression, whether they are predatory economic structures, racial hierarchies, or religious exclusion, without causing disruption. You can't. The sword Jesus brings is the sharp edge of truth. It slices through the polite illusions that keep people suffering in silence. I was recently singing "The Times They Are Changing" with a senior group, and they said, it's sad that it didn't seem to really change. And my response is, it did, but we stopped. This bending the moral arc toward justice of the universe is an ongoing effort. And we can't give up, even when there are setbacks. And in the Bob Dylan song, he talks about a truth that shakes our windows and rattles our walls. A truth that we can only ignore so long before we admit that the waters around us have grown. Pastor and author Steve Garnaas Holmes puts it this way: the blade is not violence, but discernment. Separating truth from desire, refusing to go along to get along. In thinking of Father's Day, I can't help but think about a couple of heroes in my own life who took risks to speak truth. In the 1960s, my Methodist pastor father received death threats for speaking up for civil rights. But that didn't stop him. When he spent time in Bemidji, he did some advocating for treaty rights. That wasn't very popular. In the late 90s, early 2000s, he served in some of the oldest reconciling United Methodist churches in Minnesota, which means they fully include the LGBTQ plus community, completely include. And you know what? He would receive threats. He would receive calls in the middle of the night threatening to burn the church down with him in it. Odd that in both cases he was told that, in all of these cases, he was told that he shouldn't be divisive, that he just shouldn't rock the boat. Who are you to talk about including the Native American community? You just got here into this community. But they were here a long time before that. This is what happens when people want a false peace. But they don't really want a just peace. It made them uncomfortable. Then there was my Danish immigrant pastor grandfather, who was accused of being a communist for preaching the gospel. And he was even visited by agents for the Anti-American Activities Commission. Again, being accused of trying to sow division by speaking to disrupt a false peace that used threats to silence dissent. That's not peace. And Jesus doesn't just stop with the world when he says what he says. He takes the sword into the family structure. He talks about setting a son against his father and a daughter against her mother. Hopefully the copyright police won't hit me here, but if you have listened to The Times They Are Changing, you will hear this verse. Come, mothers and fathers throughout the land, and don't criticize what you can't understand. Your sons and your daughters are beyond your command. Your old road is rapidly fading. Please get out of the new one if you can't lend a hand, for the times they are a-changing. Bob Dylan often wrote out of the Bible, and I believe that this is exactly what Bob Dylan was trying to say, and what we need to keep trying to say. And for too many people in our world, this division is not a metaphor. It is a lived and painful reality. Speaking up for LGBT liberation, committing to dismantling white supremacy, standing up for our immigrants and our immigrant neighbors, when we question rigid exclusionary dogmas that many of us learned from the time we were children. I did not, being raised by a progressive pastor. But it's driven a wedge into relationships. And our LGBTQ siblings especially know how connections with families can be strained just for being who they are. Throughout history, justice issues have often divided families. Many people know exactly what it feels like to sit at a holiday dinner table feeling like an outsider in your own family. Jesus is validating that heartbreak. He lived under the Roman Empire, where a patriarchal family unit required absolute conformity to survive. To follow Jesus meant breaking that conformity. And sometimes it involved people creating new family. Jesus is saying that when the demands of the biological family or traditional institutions conflict with the demands of love and justice, love must win. It hurts to lose connections. It hurts to lose friends because they think you're too political. But Jesus promises that when we step away from toxic conditional systems, we're invited into a much larger chosen family. We're brought into a community built on dignity and shared liberation rather than our shared DNA. And Jesus knows this work is terrifying. Standing up to empire, standing up to the religious authorities, the Pharisees, and sometimes standing up even in our own families can take a toll on our mental, emotional, and physical well-being. Think about the fear that those who helped free slaves must have experienced. The fear of fighting for civil rights. The fear of the LGBTQ community and coming out to their families and to a world that they might just be seen. The fear in the streets this past winter when advocates stood between armed, violent agents, armed with only their whistles and their phones. So right in the middle of this intense, radical call to action, Jesus stops and he starts talking about sparrows. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? He asks. See, in Jesus' time, sparrows were the cheapest food in the marketplace. They were what the poorest of the poor bought to survive. They were completely disposable at the time. By focusing on the sparrow, Jesus is making a really huge point. That the economic and political systems of this world might view certain bodies as disposable, but the divine does not. God counts every hair on your head. This is the very foundation of justice work. Not to engage in activism out of anger. Not to engage because we believe that we are right. but because we believe in the absolute inherent worth of every single soul. If God is present in the life and death of the smallest bird, then God is intimately present in the struggles of the migrant at the border, the trans teenager fighting for health care, the unhoused neighbor on our streets, and the worker fighting for a living wage. You matter to the divine, whatever you may call that. You matter to God. And because you matter, your neighbor matters. And this passage, this is also where Jesus talks about taking up his cross. How we must take up our crosses. Again, I feel like that's been misused. Sometimes it's used to justify suffering, and maybe even to say that God wants us to suffer. The church has distorted this verse for centuries, saying that it might mean tolerating domestic abuse, as I did at one point in my own life. It might mean staying in toxic situations or just quietly suffering through injustice. And that is a lie. In the Roman Empire, the cross was not some piece of jewelry you wore around your neck. It was a tool of political execution. Rome did not crucify people for their personal sins. They crucified people who disrupted the state. They crucified political agitators, rebels, and freedom fighters. And Jesus was put to death not for our individual sins as much as for the sins of the world. This worship of power, this willingness to enforce a false peace that isn't real. To take up your cross means to willingly risk your political standing, your comfort, and your privilege to stand in solidarity with those whom the modern empires seek to crush. It means letting go of our obsession with our own safety, our obsession with just going along to get along, our keeping with conformity. Jesus says, whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. When we spend our lives trying to protect our own comfort, our own wealth, our own status, that's not living. That's half a life. We become prisoners to our own fear. But when we are willing to loosen our grip on that false security, when we throw our lives into the vibrant, dangerous, and beautiful work of building God's kingdom, we finally find out what it means to truly be alive. Think of all those who willingly traded their own security for the cause of justice. The abolitionists who stood against the faces of fear and greed so that slaves could be freed. Those who fought and died to end that war, to end that practice, that violence that was continuing to be inflicted under a veneer of peace. Think about civil rights activists going into danger by the busload so that Black people could be registered to vote. As they sang, "We are not afraid," knowing that some of them may not survive this work. And some of them didn't. Some that would pay for their lives so that America would stand up to its ideals. The people at Stonewall who said no more to the criminalization of their identities. Those in the LGBTQ community who are put in danger daily just for living the truth of who they are. The young woman with her phone who refused to look away, to put her phone down and just mind her own business when George Floyd was being murdered. The people who chose to stand up for strangers among us with nothing more than those whistles and phones, knowing they could pay for it with their freedom. And Alex Preddy, Renee Good, and others paid for that with their lives. How many have taken up the proverbial cross to stand up for what's right, to stand up for a neighbor? How many choose to remain on the sidelines? The sidelines are a privilege a lot of our siblings do not have the luxury or the privilege of. How many risk division, being divisive, so that all people could be free to celebrate this recent holiday? Imagine how things could have been so different if people had chosen just to not get involved. The suffering of someone else, that doesn't matter to me. And those are the things that Jesus taught over and over again, that yes, the lives that you can't see, the lives that are hurt, that you walk away from, those lives are real. And that pain is real. And too often people are like the folks that just walk by the battered man on the road, or the battered woman, or the battered trans kid. People don't want to rock this stable, but sometimes deeply unfair peace that we live under. What would happen if people hadn't chosen to stir up the status quo? We all owe a debt to those ancestors in faith and those outside of faith who chose deeply inconvenient disruption over apathy and inaction. Dr. King often said that the people he understood the least were those who, not the oppressors themselves, but those who stood by and allowed it to happen without doing or saying anything. In my work in healing spaces, I've had to learn that being a healer doesn't always mean offering peace. It often demands that we break through patterns that no longer serve us, patterns that hold us back, by doing the hard work of things like forgiveness, to work through our physical pain. We can't heal the pain and grief and trauma until we move through them. We can't acknowledge the pain and the trauma of the past, let alone work to heal it, if we aren't willing to talk about it and move through it. The trauma and pain of others will continue as long as we don't go through this. Like a badly treated wound, this will harm people by saying peace, peace when there is no peace, to quote the prophets. And often this happens due to our own actions and inactions. Until we do the hard work of breaking through systems stacked against them, and a world drastically becoming more and more about the haves and have-nots, and that is really happening now, with the wealthy continuing to gain more and more wealth and power over many aspects of our life, including media. In that world, it's essential that we confront systems of power and demand accountability before it gets a lot worse. The sword is not an implement of violence. It never was in this statement of Jesus. It's a symbol of courage, of speaking truth to power, of risking our comfortable, I'm not into politics status for the sake of others. The sword challenges us to speak what has been spoken in the darkness and bring it into the light, into newness, into a new creation, to be willing to shake up a temporary tranquility in order to achieve a lasting and just peace. Friends, siblings in this web of life, let us not be builders of a false quiet peace. Let us be the people who are brave enough to welcome the holy disruption of Jesus. Let us take up the cross of real peace, of real unity, of real justice for all people, knowing that we are held by a love that pays attention to even the smallest sparrow, and a love that will never let us go. Amen. Peace be with you, true peace. And remember that walking in beauty sometimes means we have to disrupt the things that hurt people. See you next time.